And I also would argue that it is important for people to be free in order to achieve higher levels of development, that there is a two-way link in that relationship. While democratization is to be valued in its own terms, and I'm not going to argue that democracy is necessary because it brings development, democracy is necessary in its own terms. I mean, I think I am one of those who argue that we as human beings are inherently free. I mean, what makes us different from other animals is the fact that we are essentially free. And when one loses that aspect of ourselves, to a certain degree, it is losing what we are as human beings. So democracy should not be linked as such to whether or not democratization will lead to development. I think in its own terms, democracy and liberty is important. But I would go beyond that and say, in fact, the argument for democratization to support the efforts of development, or even more importantly, poverty alleviation, is strong and largely valid. I mean, Sen has very strongly showed empirically that, in fact, democratic countries have a much better chance to achieve much higher levels of development and with better income distribution than authoritarian regimes. Therefore, democracy is important irrespective of the effect on development, but actually democracy is extremely important for development. But even if development and poverty alleviation is possible without democratization in some cases, and as you know, one of the argument in economics that came with what's generally called the Lee thesis is that, in fact, authoritarian regimes are better placed to achieve rapid economic development. One of the common examples that is cited these days is, of course, China. Even if it is true that authoritarian regimes can achieve rapid economic growth, it doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that you need to be authoritarian to achieve rapid economic growth. I mean, you know, what we have seen in India, for example, in recent years is a clear proof that actually you can be democratic and achieve rapid economic development. But the very history of the West shows that, I mean, most economic development in the last century, the last couple of centuries, happened in societies that are democratic. Recent work, and this has been the argument that Sen was pushing, but there has been empirical studies by the World Bank. One of the most famous ones is the one that's done by Collier, El Badawi, and Sambadis, where they essentially argued that there is a strong positive link between democratization and economic development. And they argued that there are at least 4 mechanisms through which this actually through which democratization actually helps the development process. The first one, of course, is that democratic politics generally provide relative stability, and a stable polity is generally good for economic development. I mean, that's a very common, straightforward argument. The second one that relates democratization with economic development is the route through which democracy provides good governance, and good governance, of course, leads to better economic development. I mean, democratic countries are better placed to avoid corruption and maladministration compared to undemocratic ones. And therefore, democracy is in a better position to provide economic growth than undemocratic ones. The third argument in that paper, at least, which I think is valid, is that the absence of democracy invariably leads to conflict, and conflict invariably destroys infrastructure, and there is a negative consequence of this conflict to economic growth. The fourth argument is that long-term investment, which is very important for economic development, is generally possible in a stable political environment. I mean, one of the most common studies, empirical studies, show that stable polity in, you know, the business people in stable democracies generally invest in long-term projects compared to in countries where stability is not achieved. The reason being, of course, as self-interested agents, business people would rather invest in short-term trade-related activities in environments where they don't know what's going to happen in the country in 5 years or 10 years or what have you. Therefore, long-term investment requires a stable political environment. Finally, I would argue that freedom is extremely important for innovation and invention. I mean, people have to think freely in order to think about coming up with new production processes and what have you. Therefore, given all these arguments, Collier, El-Badawi, and Sambadis argue that actually the contribution of democratization to economic growth would come towards, at least in Africa, at least in the study that they showed, would range between the additional benefit of democratization to economic growth, given all other things equal, would range between 1% and 2% of GDP growth every year. And that's not small change. I mean, it's an important contribution. And real per capita GDP growth, that is. Now, the third point that I want to make in relation to this link between freedom and development is that this argument that even if it is true that development or poverty alleviation is possible through authoritarian regimes, sends argument that freedom is the end of development. In other words, the argument that says, at the end of the day, what is it that you want to acquire? What is it that you are shooting for in economic development, if it is not freedom? At the end of the day, economic progress is supposed to free us from all kinds of shortages, all kinds of insecurities, so that we can be free as human beings. So it would be a little bit absurd to destroy the end, even in a short-term basis. I mean, to destroy democracy in order to achieve economic growth, when the end itself is supposed to be democratization. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to pursue the objectives of economic growth if that is to be achieved by destroying your end, which is freedom. Therefore, the aim to justify real ugly dictatorships, such as the one prevailing in Ethiopia, in the name of possible economic development or poverty alleviation, in my view, is not valid. It certainly is self-serving when it comes from the government. I mean, we can understand why they argue. But what is a little bit disturbing is when we hear this argument provided by Western policymakers or some academics, such as Jeffrey Sachs, for example, who talks about how incredibly democratic the Mallas regime was, and mainly to do nothing but to justify their otherwise unjustifiable actions. Whether it comes from governments, policymakers, or academics, it is, at least in my view, strongly objectionable for these people to argue that you can't justify authoritarian regimes in order to justify some kind of poverty alleviation. You cannot empirically prove that, and theoretically, I don't think it is justifiable. Now, this, I just want to provide this as a background. Therefore, for a person like me, who went to Ethiopia in 1994, strictly hoping to contribute on the economic front, be it in the studies that we do at the Economic Policy Research Institute, or even in business, it was not very, you don't have to be a genius to quickly find out that if you don't solve the political crisis, the political issues quickly, then economic, the contribution that you hope in the economic field is not going to materialize. So that's the broad reason behind my own involvement, but also, I think, as an introduction to this talk. Now, let me go to the issue of Ethiopia. It's the second part of my argument. First, just especially for those of you, for Americans, to just give you a very quick background about the state that we are talking about. In 1991, when the EPRDF came to power, it was essentially a force that's predominantly, or that's dominated by a leftist, in fact, pro-Albania ethnic nationalist movement. you know, in 1990, when I think Mallas, just 2 or 3 months before he took over Addis, he was asked in a BBC interview, what is the country that you really want to emulate once you have power? And he didn't